I'm Michael Steelman, Director of Alumni Career Management and Professional Networks for William & Mary. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Day 4 of William & Mary's 5th Annual Professional Development Week. This year's programming has been intended for the whole William & Mary community of students, alumni, faculty, staff, parents, and friends. We will cover a variety of topics relevant to people at all points of their career journey, and our discussions are rooted in the National Association of Colleges and Employers career competencies. They are career and self-development, communication, equity and inclusion, leadership, professionalism, teamwork, and technology. We are truly grateful for the continued engagement of our William & Mary community to support one another's professional success, and I want to acknowledge and thank all the William & Mary Professional Network leaders, speakers, and William & Mary colleagues who provided the guidance, support, and expertise to make this week possible. I'd like to specifically thank Kelly O'Shaughnessy, Associate Director of Career Engagement, who partnered with me this year to curate a week of relevant topics and learning objectives for our William & Mary community. This week, we have had terrific presentations on the importance of growing your brand, effective ways to utilize LinkedIn, workforce trends impacting careers in today's changing economy, and values-based job searching, and how to use emotional intelligence skills to enhance an inclusive mindset. Today, we're going to focus on how to overcome crisis, motivate others, and be collaborative and innovative in today's hybrid workplace. Before I turn things over to our guest speaker, just a few technology items to cover. Today's session is being recorded, and we will notify all registrants once the recording is available. Questions are welcome, and we will address as many questions as time will allow. If you roll over the bottom portion of the Zoom window, you'll see a Q&A icon. Please use that feature to submit your questions, and we will monitor the Q&A and chat throughout the hour. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Alan Plummer and Stephen Tang. A respected business leader, innovation speaker, and commentator, Stephen Tang most recently served as President and CEO of Orashore Technologies from 2018 to 2022. Steve also served as President and CEO of the University City Science Center, the nation's first and largest urban research park in Philadelphia, and was a senior executive with Olympus America at the helm of its life science group of businesses. Prior to that, he was an energy technology entrepreneur and a senior executive at two leading global management consulting firms. Steve is also a respected commentator. His op-ed pieces have been published in the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, Philadelphia Inquirer, and Morning Call of the Allentown, Pennsylvania. Steve is currently writing a book with his work, the title of A Test of Our Time, Crisis Leadership for the Next Normal. In his business career, he has held the titles of Chairman of the Board, Chief Executive Officer, and Founder-Owner for 33 combined years. He is also a member of our William & Mary Foundation Board. Alan Plummer is the Global Head of Content for private equity firm Carlyle, where he oversees the strategy, execution, and quality of marketing and communication content across businesses, lines, and regions around the world. Throughout his 25-year career, Alan has had multiple roles at index fund giant Vanguard, including head of content and creative for the company's institutional businesses, as well as the head of social media and multiple marketing and client-facing roles. Alan began his career as a financial journalist and ghostwriter, writing them for Bloomberg, Morningstar, and The Motley Fool, and several other trade publications for advisors and RIAs. He's also authored and ghostwritten 5 books about business and finance. Alan received his MBA from William & Mary's Raymond A. Mason School of Business and his BA from Virginia Commonwealth University. He also holds multiple FINRA licenses, including the Series 7, 63, and 24. Thank you, Alan and Steve, for just your continued support over the years, your partnership in professional programming. We're delighted to have you both join us today for this conversation. Please take it away.
Thank you, Michael. We're both excited to be here. When given the opportunity to facilitate this conversation with Steve, I was thrilled. I knew you were going to bring a lot of insight. I know we're going to get a lot out of this today, and I'm looking forward to digging into things together. If I could, Steve, let me start a little bit with the impetus for the book and the idea for the book itself, right? The test for our time. That is no small statement. Talk to us a little bit, if you would, just about where the idea for the book came and kind of your path in crafting that message in that book.
Certainly, Alan and Michael and team. It's great to be here with you. And welcome everybody. Alan and I are coming to you both from the greater Philadelphia area. I think as all William & Mary alum know, since 1776, William & Mary alums have tried to do exceptional work in Philadelphia. So we're trying to keep up that tradition. The title of my book, A Test for Our Time, Crisis Leadership in the Next Normal. So I'll tell you where the impetus came from. The book is my memoir of leading a company, Orshore Technologies, during the pandemic. Orshore is a small company, quite unexpectedly was able to achieve much more than expected, namely by developing the IntelliSwab rapid COVID test, which Oprah Winfrey's company says is the easiest test to use of its kind. During the pandemic, the company went from roughly $150 million in revenue to this year, it'll do over $400 million in revenue. So they grew substantially during that time and essentially transformed itself, the company did, in many ways. And so the book is about the journey of the company, the journey of leadership throughout that process. It's a celebration of success of an underdog company that rose to new heights during a public health crisis. The crisis management piece, which we'll get into, is about how did we minimize the bad, in other words, keep everybody safe and healthy, and maximize the good, which is essentially using the crisis as an opportunity for growth, both personal and professional and company growth. If you had asked me from the outset of the pandemic, did I expect this to happen? My answer would have been absolutely no. And there's some very good reasons, I think, why it did happen. And the other thing I'd say is, and this is the famous quote by Mark Twain, is, you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Fortunately, in the 40 years since I graduated from William & Mary, as Michael said in his introduction, I've had the privilege of holding the top executive position, the CEO position, or the chairman of the board position for 33 of those combined years. And so I've lived through the crisis of this current pandemic, the Great Recession of 2008, and sadly 9/11 also. And for those of you that are current William & Mary students, I take solace that I graduated in 1982, which was a deep year of recession. So I feel the pain and challenges that you must trying to pursue the job market right now. So for all those reasons, I thought it was a story worth telling and sharing. And my hope is that we can learn something from it. As crises mount up in what I'll call the next normal, which we'll talk about, I believe this will be a style of doing business, not just a moment of crisis to be solved.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's incredibly helpful. And I definitely want to get into this idea of the new normal, the next normal here in just a moment. But before we go there, I want to speak to the participants that we have on with us. I want to hear from you, and we're going to come back to this question in a few minutes. A lot of us on this call are leaders. All of us, or most of us, are working in hybrid environments. Things are certainly different now than they were before the pandemic. We'd like to hear from you in the chat and the Q&A. What do you think is needed for successful hybrid leadership in this current environment? Jot your thoughts down in the Q&A. I'm going to monitor here on the side. We're going to come back to those answers in a moment, but I encourage you guys to put answers in there for the next couple minutes if you don't mind. Steve, that said, let's come back to this idea of the next normal. You know, when you and I were preparing for this, I thought it was a really interesting topic. You've seen a lot, you've weathered a lot, you have led through some very challenging environments. What makes this situation unique? What makes this environment we're in now, this next normal, to use your term?
Certainly. So I need to define terms because I think it's a little bit confusing, maybe a little esoteric, but what I would call the past normal, the old normal, is what life was like up until we all went into isolation. And for most of us, that was March 13th, 2020, right? And then the new normal, which is what we're still living through, is what we developed during the pandemic, and that includes things like preventative measures to avoid infection, working from home, the start of hybrid work that you just mentioned. And so that's where we are right now. And notably, what I say about this new normal is we didn't do it intentionally. We did it because we had to. And it was very much by accident that we've gotten here. The next normal would, I think, be a gathering point where things will be done much more intentionally. And so it'll be an opportunity for us to look at sustainable long-term changes, utilizing technology and different approaches to human interaction. It'll also be a time for us to reevaluate our lives and prioritize what's important to us and make sure that we don't take anything for granted. So that's what I mean by the next normal. I think it will be, the next normal will likely be a situation where there are not just one crisis like the pandemic, but as I think we've experienced so far, many other factors, global climate change, social unrest, political upheaval, geopolitical power struggles, all those coming together. And so if I were to borrow a term from Hollywood, it could be everything, everywhere, all at once for us. And that'll be a lot to contend with. And that's why the focus on crisis leadership, I think, will be very important. Crisis leadership used to be something that was in a binder on your shelf that you pulled out if there was a natural disaster or something very unfortunate happened to your company. I think crisis leadership will be a style of doing business going forward that takes the learning from this generational pandemic and crisis that we are living through right now and applies it to better ways of leading and managing people.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think what's interesting about this moment as well is, in addition to the things that you just identified, Steve, it's almost, for me, in my perspective, it feels a little bit like we're at an inflection point, right? So as you alluded to, we ended up here accidentally. A lot of people on this call and a lot of corporations and a lot of knowledge workers really put their head down. They got through the pandemic. And now it sounds like a lot of what you're getting towards is this idea of like, it's time to reflect. It's time to start to think forward, think strategically, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so let's go from there into kind of the next topic, which is really one of around strategy. So I think we talk a lot about strategy, and obviously goes hand in hand with the idea of crisis. But when you think about the importance of strategy in this next normal and what this looks like, where do you see strategy fitting into all this? What does that look like in terms of this new landscape?
Certainly, it's strategy has always been one of these exercises that every company goes through, and the leadership of the company typically participates in it. I think in the best companies, many people participate in it. And so, my view on that is that strategy will continue and be much more intricate because it'll have to involve many more options on the table based on how things move in the external environment and how crises shift over time. I was a general management consultant for several years, and so there were many ways of dressing up strategy, but let me just kind of narrow it down. I think there's a very short and simple description that I use in the book, and that is that successful strategy is the confluence of opportunity and capability. Okay, and capability and opportunity are not static; they move over time, and they have to be updated over time as well. And part of, I think, the challenge right now when we talk about hybrid work or remote work is that we haven't really been intentional about what capabilities are really needed to be successful in that new operating mode. So that's very simply, I think, how I define it. And I think that when we think about crisis and how crisis can upend strategy, really anything unforeseen that throws plans completely out of whack are what I would call crises. And crises can also be opportunities. They can not just be things to avoid, they can be things to be capitalized on. So from an employee's perspective, and particularly a leader or an aspiring leader's perspective, I think it's really important to be attuned to how the company is approaching strategy and how you contribute to it. It's also key to make sure that your capabilities are being tuned to where the strategy is leading, and not simply be where you are today. And that's why these sessions that highlight professional development, like we're doing right now, are so vitally important. So it will be I think, an era where strategy is important because companies are going to need to be more resilient, more agile, more responsive, and I think everyone will be involved in executing the strategy and developing the strategy.
There we go. Sorry. No, that's a great answer. Thank you. And one of the phrases that comes to mind that I find myself using quite often is change is the only constant. And it certainly feels like that the past couple of years. And I don't think that's going to differ anytime soon. Steve, we have a question from the audience that I'd like to throw out at you before we move on. I think this is really interesting. When we think about working remotely and moving back to a hybrid model, Chris, one of the participants, asked, said, what are your thoughts, Steve, on remote work in terms of productivity? Is remote work the next normal, or are we going back to like the old normal where everybody goes back to the office? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is the question of the year. 2023 will be the year that companies need to sort that out. Based on what I've seen and heard in the marketplace, I think it's very likely that hybrid and remote work will be here to stay. I don't know many companies that can even consider full-time in office at this point. And part of the reason is because some employees use the opportunity to move elsewhere and are not physically close to their would-be office. And companies, I think, are somewhat reluctant to address those types of issues. So if we look at where I think the work environment is going, I think that the most important thing is how to build trust between the employer and the employee, right? And that's really fundamentally what's needed, whether the environment is all in office or hybrid or remote. I think one of the key lessons learned during the pandemic is if you're going to build trust with your employees, it involves a number of factors, and this is in the book also, but credibility, in other words, you do what you say you're going to do. Intimacy, which is, that I have your back and I know that you have my back. And so anytime that trust is needed to rise exponentially when there's a high risk situation like a crisis, or you're doing something you've never done before, both of those factors, credibility, intimacy, have to be extremely high. I think one of the key questions that was asked and answered during the pandemic was, do we really trust people to work at home? And I think that if you had asked people that before the pandemic, they would have said, no way. People are going to goof off and do their own thing. We'll never get the productivity. I can tell you from my own personal experience at Orshore, that just didn't happen. In fact, we had the opposite problem. We had people working many long hours, probably too long hours, to get the work done in their homes, along with dealing with a whole host of family issues, personal issues, and everything else that involve keeping themselves safe. So it starts with trust, and I think from there we can go to what are the fundamentals of what hybrid work means and how it can be better. But I think about it in those terms. I mean, if you're going to be a supervisor or you're going to be supervised, somehow trust has to be very high. Otherwise, you're going to invite somebody to be looking over your shoulder or monitoring your keystrokes on your keyboard, and I don't think any of us want to go there.
No, and thank you for that. And one of the things I've experienced too, Steve, is that it's not often a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that's what is so interesting and challenging for a lot of leaders in the moment. Sometimes it varies by role, sometimes it varies by culture. Different individuals and workers have different needs, right? So there is that complexity of this environment that just, I think you're right. I think we're going to be moving in a direction where different companies are going to have different approaches, and they're going to have to be flexible and coordinated. and recognize based on roles and individuals what they need and can still perform.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Alan. You know, in the book, I raised 5 questions for leaders to ask about being intentional about employees returning to the office. And if you don't mind, I'll share those with you
Yeah,
right
please.
now. And these are questions for the leader. Okay. And so if you think about the various levels of leadership within an organization, to me, this is best solved from the ground up and sort of a bottoms up approach. So the first question is, in what ways is my presence in the office for my benefit? The second one is, in what ways is my presence in the office for the benefit of those that I serve? The third one is, what are the direct and indirect costs of synchronous meeting time? And we can talk about what that means. And how does that compare for in-person or hybrid working situations? The fourth one is, how do I think about effective asynchronous communication? So synchronous communication is within a meeting, asynchronous thinking about outside of a meeting. And what have I learned about avoiding crisis with preemptive communication during the pandemic? So I think if those are critically answered from the bottom up, organizations will get to the right answer about why people need to be in the office and what role hybrid work and remote work has overall. But I just don't think we're there yet. I think that many companies have to be intentional first.
That's great. Thank you. What I'd like to do is dig in a little bit more, Steve, into this idea of being effective leaders in that hybrid environment. You've talked about asynchronous versus synchronous communication. There's a few other things I know that are critically important in terms of that and some of the skills that were developed during the pandemic. If you could, let's double click on that and go into some of the things that you've observed around what it means to be an effective leader in this space.
Yeah, so I think there are 3 things that I would say about that, Alan. The first and foremost, whether you're an effective remote or hybrid manager, you have to be intentional about creating and maintaining team cohesion. I think that's the first and foremost thing. And again, go back to trust, credibility, intimacy to build that trust. When people aren't all physically together in the office, it takes extra effort to ensure that team members feel connected to each other and invested in the team's success. And that, of course, starts with regular, clear communication from the manager about the goals, progress, and challenges. But it also requires opportunities for team members to interact socially and build relationships with each other. And that's a difficult thing to do, when people are in different locations. Second, remote and hybrid managers need to be experts in using technology to facilitate communication and collaboration. When team members are in different locations or even just working remotely at different times, it's really essential to have systems and tools in place that everybody can use to stay connected and work effectively together. That might include, video call software for team meetings, project management tools to track assignments and deadlines, or instant messaging apps for quick responses and conversations. One of the tools that I love to use right now is Otter AI, which makes a transcript of video calls so that you don't have to take notes. People, interestingly enough, will be briefer when they know they're being recorded for a transcript, which I think is always a helpful thing during meetings. And then the last thing I'd say is remote and hybrid managers need to be flexible and adjust their approaches to the needs of their team and as their needs of the team change. What works well for mostly remote teams may not work well when some team members start coming in the office more often. So it's a very dynamic situation. And I think as we continue to evolve beyond the pandemic, the manager may need to change the approach again. So it's the overall, I think, message here is it's important to be open to new ideas and willing to experiment to find what works best for your teams.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm looking over some of the responses we've got in the chat, Steve, and there's definitely alignment between what our participants are commenting and thinking and what you're saying. Lots of comments around trust, need to help create a sense of belonging at work post-COVID. I know that certainly resonates with you. More communication and increased presence. This is an interesting one. It feels like some leaders hibernated during the early stages of COVID, and teams need to see and hear from their leaders. I think we've seen and heard that in spaces. Clear and concise communications, making goals and expectations clear, eliminating kind of ambiguity is a key piece. And the ability to coach and develop employees. And like you were saying, help them kind of adapt to change. If we could, let's talk a little bit about the communication piece. I do have one question that I want to follow up with you, but let's talk first about kind of the written communication component, because we are talking about pivoting. And one of the things that's interesting in this environment is the mix of Zoom calls versus emails versus being in the office, and being able for things to feel seamless when they're not, when technology can make things feel really fragmented. You and I know, I certainly have opinions there being a writer in terms of the importance of written communication. But talk to me a little bit about what you've seen and felt in that place over the past couple of years, and why written communication is just as important now as it's ever been, if not more so.
Yeah, it really breaks my heart when I hear people say that their leaders were disengaged or hibernated during the pandemic.
Agreed.
One of the approaches that I found worked extremely well was I began to write weekly letters to my employees beginning in April of 2020. And by the time when I left the company in April of 2022, I had over 250 pages of correspondences, and they weren't just me sending out letters. They were people responding to the letters.
Right.
And so what that taught me was that it's important to engage your employees and even tell them when you don't know the answers. And I think it's very important, particularly when there's so much uncertainty dealing with something like the pandemic, that people know that you believe that safety and well-being is the top priority. And those were messages that I tried to hammer home firsthand a lot during the pandemic, and then open it up for some lighter topics. I mean, talk about your first job, talk about your mother's on Mother's Day, your father's on Father's Day, talk about how we're taking care of each other and emphasizing the resources the company has. And all those things I think are nice to have in written form, because you can refine them. I think that people tend to be more clear in what they want to say, and put time into editing rather than just throw things out there. I think that's vital also. And the last thing I say, which we can come back to, is, I think in terms of written communication, having a single source of truth in some sort of document, whether it's Slack or Notion or Google Docs, vitally important for everybody to reference, so that when a team has to gather for a meeting, nobody is not in the know for what's going on.
Right. And that gets into this idea of asynchronous versus synchronous communication again, which I think has been not downplayed, but been a bit of a surprise through all this. You touched on that very briefly, but to me personally, and as a leader myself, this is one of the most interesting elements about what we're going through, is this difference here.
Yeah, I think part of what I observed during the pandemic is that, it's like managers got to manage, right?
Yep.
If the only tool, if you're a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And, and that's the case of what your first instinct is to convene a meeting, right? And I think there have been just way too many meetings that have proliferated through the pandemic, which means essentially that people don't get their work done and have to work longer and harder hours to achieve the same amount of progress. And so this notion of asynchronous meeting, which is essentially, I get your input through Slack or Notion or email, or chat, whatever the case may be, but I'll look at it on my own time. And what it preserves is more dedicated time for everybody to do the work in their own way. I think that one of the key tenets, I think that allowed Orshore to be successful during the pandemic was empowerment. Well, empowerment has to have, accountability behind it. Part of it is letting people work the way that they work best. I think there's a tremendous amount of research that's been done about leaving open spaces in your day's agenda to be able to get into a state of flow, if you will, where you're optimizing your work. Even when you're in a creative endeavor, and a lot of work is being put into, well, the creative teams have to be all together. I think that's a real misnomer. I think that what research is taught us is that even the most creative teams work in a mode called burstiness, right? And that's when collaboration's marked by patterns of high energy and an abundance of great ideas. But those are short periods of time where you can go off and do that, on your own and come back to the team and really push the idea forward. So this idea of synchronous and asynchronous work, I think, needs to be sorted out very intentionally by managers and leaders. And if you're drowning in meetings, maybe this is one way to tap on your supervisor's shoulder or gently nudge them into ways of better negotiating that.
Yeah, and I will fully admit that as a creative leader myself, pre-pandemic, I certainly thought that all of the creatives had to co-locate and work together. It's been eye-opening for me and a lot of the folks that I work with to see the power of not just chats like Slack, but whiteboarding platforms, murals, and ways to kind of ideate and be able to collaborate in real time across technology. It's as you've said, Steve, it's a very different landscape than just as recently as 5 years ago. So yes, 100% agree. Let me ask a follow-up question if I could. We talked a little bit about trust a few moments ago, and there was an interesting question from one of the participants that I wanted to throw out at you. So when we think about trust and this idea of written communication and working styles and asynchronous versus synchronous, how do you build that type of environment, that type of culture, when you've got a hybrid team where some people are remote and some might be in the office, but you hired them during the pandemic? It's one thing to take an existing team that and navigate this new landscape. But for some of us, we're figuring this out with people that we perhaps have never met or never interviewed face to face.
Yeah, the pandemic taught us a lot of things about what's real and what were myths, right?
Right.
Part of one myth is that if I can't look you eye to eye, then I can't trust you. Well, I'm talking to you right now, Alan, and I'm not looking you in the eye. I'm looking at your picture because I want to see what your reaction is. If I were to try to look you in the eye, I'd be staring at the camera, and I couldn't tell what your reaction was.
Right.
So I think there are a lot of things that were dispelled during the pandemic. But Orchard hired people, even laboratory R&D scientists from as far away places as California and Florida, and then relocated to Pennsylvania. So it can work, and several senior executives that we hired were from around the country, not in proximity to the company's office, and so that I think we have to acknowledge that actually did work. Okay, now your question was, how do you build trust in that environment? I think it's first of all respecting that people's working styles are very different. Okay. One of the things I point out in the book is some work done by a Wharton professor named Nancy Rothbard, who talks about the difference between integrators and segmenters in terms of working style. Yeah. So this is something that never had to be negotiated when you could walk down the hallway and see your team. But some people are integrators, and that is they're comfortable blurring the boundary between work and personal and home life. And can respond at a moment's notice and shift on a moment's notice between an issue that's personal or one that's professional. And then you have people that they're called segmenters, and those people want clear separation between their professional and their personal lives. Now, both approaches have strengths, and I think managers, in order to build trust with their team, need to be aware of the differences and capitalize on those effectively. So, it's a bit of one-on-one negotiation between the team leader and the employee, but there's also, I think, respect for how the working style is going to be different across the team. That is, I think, one of the things that has been missing in terms of intentionally designing the work environment today. And I think it's also one that leads to a lot of strife, because if everybody expects everybody else to be a segmenter and be on and only working on things related to work from 9 to 5, that's just not the way that the world works anymore. Many people are still juggling responsibilities with family and other personal needs. And I think that will continue for the foreseeable future. And so we better get used to this, and we better get used to building trust based on these kind of differences.
And back to your point, clear communication, because it's even a cultural aspect as well. So as you kind of so clearly put it, regardless of where I may fall in terms of being an integrator, or if I'm working with Kelly, and for example, Kelly's a segmenter and we're making different assumptions, but to your point, we're not communicating clearly, or we're not clearly understanding where each other are coming from and what's going on in our day-to-day lives, there's going to be opportunities for miscommunication and friction and frustration. I completely get that. And this was one of the things that I thought was so interesting as we prepared for today, was that just this idea of integration, even for me, caused me to step back a little bit since our last call and really think through kind of, hey, what does that mean? What does that look like? And even for me, I've traditionally fallen into that segmentation approach. And it was always meant take your laptop with you, but if you're taking it somewhere, you open the laptop, you log in and work. But now, to your point, depending on roles and responsibilities, it can be incredibly easy through Teams or through software to be able to review a document on your phone while you're cooking dinner in the kitchen, right? And almost multitask between work and life. So even mentally, I'm finding for myself, I don't know about others here on the call, but it's an interesting dichotomy for me, even as an individual, to learn how I can need to think differently about the fluidity between them.
Yeah, I think we all need to take sort of personal inventory, Alan, as you just said, about, how is it that we are effective as individuals, before we can negotiate that with team members or our team leader. And so that's a very important first step.
Yeah, thank you. And if we think about kind of one of the most important phrases that you have in your book that I really, really like, you say in the book, lead whole people wholeheartedly. What does that mean? Expand on that for us, and what that phrase carries.
One of the things that I really reflected on after leaving the company was how did we do this? How were we able to go from a $150 million company to a $400 million company and increase our manufacturing capacity by a factor of 5 or 6? Okay, hire all the people needed to do that. This is an FDA regulated product, so there's a whole infrastructure around ensuring quality and compliance and regulatory adherence. So that was an amazing feat in its own right. Okay, and what it came down to was things I talked about before, which was empowerment and accountability. But even beyond that, early on in the pandemic, I think we had to establish, and I had to establish, that the safety and well-being of employees came first. And so we had to treat them with compassion and empathy from the outset in order to gain their trust. Remember, credibility and intimacy. Credibility, you're going to do what you say you're going to do. Intimacy, I've got your back and you've got my back. And really understand that, they were immersed in a whole host of personal and professional challenges. So that's what that phrase means. Lead whole people wholeheartedly was really the secret of our success at OraSure, and what I believe will be the secret of success in leading and going forward into the next normal, with the high probability that a lot of crises will happen all at the same time. So what do I mean by that? There are a couple ways I'd explain it. First of all, it's probably an honest mistake to think that wholehearted leadership means just being nice. Okay, it's more than that. Okay, and the way I'd say it is that we need to be both compassionate and wise. And wisdom in this context refers to a deep understanding of what motivates people, and how to manage them so they deliver on agreed upon priorities, especially when those priorities are things that they've never done before, right? To be effective leaders, we need to be able to navigate the tension between being caring and thoughtful and holding people to high standards. I think that requires openness and active listening so we can understand the unique circumstances of each team members. So I think it's those are all part of it. And then the other part of it is what I mean by whole people. If we expect as leaders that people are just going to do what we say we want them to do because we're paying them, I think we're well beyond that. The pandemic has taught us that we're well beyond that. The fact of the matter is, people have their own challenges day in and day out. And whether leaders like it or not, they are going to bring that with them to work, whether they're working in their dining room, or they're working in a cubicle or an office or in your factory or warehouse, wherever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to really lead wholeheartedly and know that we have whole people that need us to appreciate them as whole people. The other thing that it suggests, and it's something that I think that Orsher embedded into his culture, is people are more than just bodies and minds. They have spirits also. And to be conscious of the health of their mind, their body, and their spirit is to treat them as whole people. And to lead them wholeheartedly, I think, is the key to success in any situation.
I love that. I love that. The world needs more of that. And I 100% am there with you. Absolutely. I do want to switch. We have a couple questions. I would switch over to the Q&A portion. Thank you. I've got a couple questions here in the Q&A. Keep them coming, folks. But let's do a little bit of round robin if we could, Steve. Let's throw a couple audience or participant questions our way and see what we think. The first one is from Lisa. Lisa asked, do you think that the hybrid/remote work environment encourages a more diverse workforce?
Great question.
It's great. I love it.
I just saw a statistic the other day which blew my mind, and that is the number of people who express that they have a disability of some sort has risen astronomically during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So that's one indicator that yes, you're getting more diversity because you've removed the barrier of a disability in the workplace by allowing people to work remotely. Okay, so that's one thing. Yeah. As far as other types of diversity, and I'm a great proponent of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And it's not just because I think it's a good thing. Orshore's mission was around global public health. For instance, the eradication of HIV/AIDS. Well, if you don't understand the patients and the consumers that you're trying to serve in eradicating that disease, then you're not serving them well. And to do that, you need to appreciate who they are and what their needs are. So all that I think comes together in saying that it's vitally important to have diversity. In an innovative company, it's even more important because I think the research is very solid that the more diverse backgrounds and experiences and identities that you have at the table, the better chance you have of culling the best ideas and then implementing them. So yes, wholeheartedly, I believe that remote work has promoted better diversity, and hopefully a shift to hybrid won't harm that.
I agree. I mean, I'll add, Stephen, just from my perception as a leader during the pandemic, I saw it not only help with diversity, but also inclusion. One of the things I joke with people about is when you're in a meeting room, the boss has the biggest presence. I think it was you who said to me, Steve, when we're all on camera, we've all got the same size box. I mean, there's something to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen reports, particularly from women in leadership roles and aspiring to leadership roles, that this is a much more egalitarian environment here on the Zoom screen than it is in the conference room. Okay, right. And then you don't have to worry about the imposing presence of certain people and how they might dominate conversations. I think it's important for leaders to facilitate these discussions to make sure everybody's being included. I think that there ought to be a rule that if you're in a Zoom meeting, you have to have your camera on. You can't have your camera off, because if you have your camera off, I know what you're doing. You're multitasking and trying to do the work that you should be doing, because that the meeting is displacing, right?
Right.
But if you can be present for a high quality meeting and participate in it, I think it's great. The other thing I'd say, Alan, just about behavior is the leader should always speak last, right? Because otherwise you're inviting a behavior of just validate what the leader is saying. And I feel like if you're doing that, there's no need to have the meeting. The leader should just talk, right?
Send an email. But again, it's another great example of leading with intent, right? And being intentional in this environment. I think that's one of the themes that's coming through loud and clear through our conversation, is just intent. We have one more question. Again, I'll open it up to the group if there's any other kind of straggling questions, but we do have one more from Chris for you, Steve. Is 2023 a year to explore business opportunities to grow and scale, or is this going to be a year to cut costs, i.e. headcount, and increase efficiency?
Well, I think every company, every company is in a different situation, but I have to think that there are going to be situations where companies are going to try to do both.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's going to create some confusion. So if you're on the top of the pyramid and you're trying to send a clear message about the company's direction, what you say about those two topics is going to be parsed many different ways. And so it's very important to be clear about what you're trying to accomplish. So let's go back to the strategy. Strategy is opportunity overlap with capability, right? Mm-hmm. And so if there are going to be cuts, that means you're going to be reducing the capability, and then you should be revisiting the strategy to make sure that you can capitalize on those opportunities in the way that you thought you were going to. I think the business should always be about opportunity and looking for growth, regardless of your industry or your company. But I do think this is still a precarious economic environment we're in right now. And so I think leaders are going to be naturally cautious about it. So if you're somebody that's promoting an idea that you want to be funded and implemented, I'd say be very astute to the language that the leaders are using, and find a way to make your proposal compelling by using the same language that they're using.
Right. That's great. Thank you. I actually have a follow-up question, or a variation of a question for you, if you don't mind. So we've talked a lot about what it means to be a successful leader in a hybrid environment. What about those of us who are actually fortunate enough to hire in this environment, and we're hiring workers in a hybrid space, and obviously need to be looking for perhaps some different or additional soft skills? What do you think about as a hiring manager, and what to look for in terms of candidates in this world?
Yeah, that I think has not been done intentionally, Alan. In other words, we're working off the same script of hiring people as if we're walking into a conference room and sitting across from them at a table and interviewing them. Yeah. I would like to see much more of a tack towards, what did you do during the pandemic, and how have you been affected in a hybrid or work environment? And how conscious are you about those behaviors, and can you articulate that? Okay, I think that will begin to open up the discussion. As far as the cultural skills, I'll reveal one of my secrets here, and that's, I ask 3 open-ended questions when I hire people that are going to report to me. So these are, very senior executives. Mm-hmm. And those 3 questions are, tell me about yourself as a person, as a colleague, and as a leader. And I let them, of course, clarify the question, but I essentially want to hear what is said and what's not said in that description. And my way of following up on that, once they've shared what they wanted to share, is to get to the unspoken pieces of it, to determine whether they're a good cultural fit. And whether, I think, moreover, they bring something to the table in terms of skills and perspectives and approach that I don't have on my team right now. And so I always want to be adding different pieces and different perspectives to add to the diversity of the team's way of thinking.
That's a great suggestion. I love that. Thank you. And just to your point, the idea of what's not said, I think is incredibly powerful as well. We do not have any more questions. I'll open it up to the floor if there's anything else from the group. But I believe if not, I mean, I think we're coming to the end of our time together. This has been great. I'm just keeping an eye on the Q&A. I think we're in good shape. But Kelly, it sounds like it might be time to hand it over to you.
I'll give you another few minutes back because we just got one more question.
Oh, great. Let me look and see if I can find
Because
it.
do you think panel interviews are effective in figuring out if a potential hire fits the company culture?
So I'm going to interpret panel interviews in a way of saying it's more than one person interviewing the candidate at the same time.
And that's what I'm reading as well. More than one members of the current team interviewing, rather not more than one candidate at a time.
Right. So I always think it's better to have more ears than mouths on an interview. And that's because I think, while one person is asking a question, the other person can be deeply observing and listening. And so that sort of team approach to evaluation, I think, is very important. So there's also something to be said as you get down and you narrow the field. I think one-on-one interviews are better because you can get a better feel for the individual. It used to be that nobody would ever get hired into a senior level position without having a meal with the individual, just to see how they behave under those circumstances. I still think that's a good idea. I think it's particularly challenging in a remote or hybrid environment to do that. But I've said a lot about the inevitability of hybrid and remote work, but I also want to say that the interaction and personal connection in one room, sitting with a person, is still vital. And to the degree that you can still do that, I think it's really important, particularly for key hires, particularly for people that you are asking to help transform a company. I mean, that's where being sensitive to the culture and bringing something different to the table, to the company, both need to be explored.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight. Well, with that, I want to thank both Stephen and Alan for sharing your knowledge and advice with the William & Mary community today. We especially take the time and appreciate the time and effort you took in preparing your session today on leadership in a time of crisis. To all the participants on today's webinar, we expect that you've gained a new perspective or two on leadership in crisis and considering what the future of work can look like with strong leadership at an organization that incorporates trust, credibility, intimacy, and flexibility. For those currently in leadership roles, we hope you have picked up some actionable strategies for yourselves. And for those who are searching, we expect that you've gathered some key elements of what you may want to determine an organization has in order to be a good fit for you with your values, needs, and expectations. As Michael mentioned at the beginning of the session, throughout the week, we have been incorporating the NACE career competencies. And today we've had a focus on critical thinking, communication, equity and inclusion, leadership, and professionalism. You hit at least more than half of them today. You can find a full list of the competency connections on the Learning Objectives page of the Professional Development Week website, as well as LinkedIn follow-up messages you'll receive. When this meeting closes, you'll have access to a quick survey so you can share your thoughts on this portion of the William & Mary Professional Development Week. Additionally, please take a few minutes for yourself today to highlight some of the notes of what you've learned from our session. And then make sure you give yourself 1 to 3 actionable next steps for yourself to continue your own professional development. Soon we'll follow up with a recap message and provide links to recordings that will be available to the full community. And finally, I'd like to draw your attention to our last event this week. Tomorrow, Friday, March 3rd at 12 noon Eastern Time is the online networking hour. After taking advantage of any of the sessions this week where you've learned from the William & Mary community members, why not take the opportunity to connect one-on-one with members of the community as well? You can still register to join that session tomorrow afternoon. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Go Tribe.
Go Tribe. Bye.